Hello, everyone. My name is Becky Robinson, and I am so thrilled to be here today with Lisa Fain and Lois Zachary. We will be getting started in just a few moments, but we want to give a chance for all of you to get into the room. So as you're coming in, we would invite you to find the chat panel, and we would love to hear where you're calling in from today. So if you could find the chat and be sure to select all panelists and attendees so that throughout today's event, we can be interacting with one another and everyone can see what you're typing. So welcome John in Washington, PA, and Daryl in Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome in Richmond, Virginia. Baltimore, Maryland. Welcome in Berlin and Philly and Calgary and Arizona and Vegas. Thanks to those of you who are sharing with us where you're calling in from. I will remind you, if you would, to please use the drop-down menu to select all panelists and attendees. One of the things that we've noticed over doing many webinars is that you all have so many amazing insights and ideas to share, and we would love for everyone who's on the call to be able to see those. So I'm seeing more international callers. Welcome in Scotland and, cool places like Kokomo, Indiana. So it's great to see you. Today we will be talking about the topic of Lisa and Lois's brand new book, Bridging Differences for Better Mentoring. I have a copy here in my office with me. It just released this week, and so it is so amazing to have you with us to learn about the book in the week of its release and to celebrate with Lois and Lisa. So quickly, before we get started with our content, I would love to know if you are a friend of Lois and Lisa, if you're aware of the Center for Mentoring Excellence, or if their work is brand new to you. So if their work is new to you, please type in the chat, new to me, and we would love to hear that from you. Wow, lots of news new to me, lots and lots and lots of new to me's going in the chat. So thank you. A few technical considerations for today's event. The first one is that we are recording and we will share the recording with you so that you can potentially share it with a colleague or friend. The second thing is that we will have a number of slides on the screen today, a selection of them, and we will send them with our follow-up materials to you as a PDF. So no need to scribble down all the information from the slides. We will be providing them to you. So I've been talking a mile a minute. Hi, Lois. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Can you tell us where you are today?
We are actually both here in Seattle, Washington.
And I'd like to report that it is sunny in Seattle, Washington today.
That is amazing. It is also sunny here in Lambertville, Michigan, although we have a ton of snow that I had to brave to get here. Okay, so we're going to get started with a few polls, but before we do that, I want to take a quick moment to introduce you to Lois and to Lisa, especially since they may be new to you. If you didn't already know, Lois and Lisa are mother and daughter. And Lois was the founder of Leadership Development Services and the Center for Mentoring Excellence. And Lisa is now the CEO for the Center of Mentoring Excellence. So this is a two-generation family business focused on mentoring. Lois has written previous books, including The Mentor's Guide, The Mentee's Guide, Creating a Mentoring Culture, and Starting Strong, and has now joined forces with her daughter to craft this new book, Bridging Differences for Better Mentoring. And this book is the topic of today's webinar. Lisa, in addition to being the author of this book and the CEO of the Center for Mentoring Excellence, is a speaker and a facilitator. And I've enjoyed so much getting to know the two of you, and I'm so looking forward to the conversation. We will be sharing slides later on. I see a question from someone about screens being blank. You should be seeing my face and Lisa's face and Lois's face, and then later you will also see some slides. So as we get started, we would love to get some insight into your information on today's topics. And what I'm going to do is launch some polls, and we have three. We're going to go through them fairly quickly to get an idea of your experience as it relates to mentoring. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. The first question is, have you had a formal mentor, yes or no? And I'm going to give you a few moments on that one. How would you define a formal mentor, Lois or Lisa?
Well, if we talk about a formal mentor, normally we talk about, I'm going to want to distinguish that from formal mentoring, but it's under the aegis of a program. And there are certain expectations that are part of the program, so that as opposed to an informal mentoring relationship which would mean that you're mentoring and you might still have a structure, but there is no external accountability for the mentoring relationship. Would you agree with that, Lisa?
Perfect. Formal mentor affiliated with some sort of program, some kind of structure where you set forth some expectations about what govern your relationship.
So let's take a look. Of the people on today's call who answered the poll, 67% have never had a formal mentor. Only 33% have had a formal mentor. So I'm going to take a look at the second poll. And as I said, we're going to go through these quickly. Poll question number 2, have you been a formal mentor? And so with Lois's definition, that would be part of a mentoring program. A mentor as part of a formal mentoring program. If for some reason you can't see the poll, we would welcome your response in the chat. One of the things I've heard is that if you're using the Zoom app on mobile, you can't see the polls. You need to be on the browser app to be able to see the polls, I believe. So we're going to give a few more seconds on the second question. Have you been a formal mentor? And it looks like we have Joanne on the call, who's a manager of a mentoring program in her organization. Fantastic. So let's take a look at these results. Of the people on the call, only 42% have been formal mentors and 58% have not. And let's quickly take a look at poll number 3. Does your organization support a formal mentoring program? That question seems to be cut off, but I'm going to launch this poll. The full question is, does your organization support a formal mentoring program? We'll give you a few moments on that. So that's confusing. We've got some folks on mobile app who are seeing the poll and some folks who are on browser apps and not able to see the poll. We'll try to work that out for you before our next event. In the meantime, we would welcome your answers to the poll questions in the chat panel. So thanks, Lucille. Yes, but not for all employees. Joanne mentions that they have a formal mentoring program and a formal mentoring aspect to their leadership development program. So let's quickly take a look at these results. 53% of the folks who are on today's call work in organizations that support formal mentoring programs, and 47% do not. So any responses on these results before we move on, Lisa or Lois?
You know, it's so interesting to see how many people, I think the numbers seem quite high actually, of the people who've been in formal mentorship or have been a formal mentor, and certainly of those who have formal mentoring programs. I noted there was also a really important comment about having a formal mentoring aspect of a broader leadership development program, which really speaks to the things that we're going to be talking about today, about mentoring being a leadership competency. And so that's a really important and insightful comment in the chat room as well.
I think, Lisa, it's also, besides being a competency, that it's also a responsibility of leaders.
Exactly.
That's really powerful. Well, let's dive in. Let's talk first. What are the key ideas in this new book, Bridging Differences for Better Mentoring?
So the key here is that creating an inclusive workplace where we can foster relationships, and in those relationships, differences are really celebrated and they're valued, and mentoring partners feel comfortable showing up authentically. That is the theme of our book, is how do you do that? How do you exercise the skill of cultural competency to welcome differences into a mentoring relationship and really leverage those so that you can make the most of your mentoring relationships?
Yeah, and you know, Lisa, I think it's important to point out that people are not inherently different. Our differences lie between us, not within us. So we believe that by leaning forward, by learning from those differences, and by leveraging them, that's how you create stronger, better mentoring relationships. So we hope that those of you who read our book will take away a cultural awareness and an understanding that's going to help you in working not only in a mentoring environment, but with the people who are in your organization as well.
Yeah, you know, we focused on just some of the many differences that exist between mentoring partners. The purpose really isn't to talk about how different we are, although we all are different. It's to stoke your curiosity and to enhance learning. It's also to see those differences as something to be celebrated, not to be shied away from. So by leaning forward, learning, and leveraging, we believe, and I think we've shown in this book, that mentoring relationships will improve and they're going to be much more authentic and rewarding.
That's really helpful. So the purpose of identifying the differences is not to call attention to them, but to help us get curious and learn and grow together. So let's start with this idea of lean forward. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you mean when you say lean forward?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked. Leaning forward really involves developing cultural competency and developing your self-understanding and your own skill at seeing differences. So the bottom line is about preparing to recognize, to acknowledge, and also bridge differences in your mentoring relationships. So what we've done in our book is we have included 3 stories. They're what we call fictional narratives. They're composite stories we crafted as kind of amalgams of the hundreds of mentors and mentees that we have interviewed over the years. So we'd like to share with you a short excerpt from one of the stories. But before we do, we want to set a little context here. So I want to introduce you to Mia. Mia is an associate at a large law firm that we've called Farmer, French, and Fowler, F3 to those of us who are familiar with it. And Christopher is her mentor. At their very first meeting, Mia brought along a long list of goals that she wanted to work on, and she handed them to Christopher. Christopher asked her to put it away. He wanted to take some time to get to know her first. So our excerpt begins at their second meeting. So if you bear with me, let me share. Mia walked into Christopher's office with a pen and a notebook. No lists this time. She felt a real urgency to get to work on her list of goals. Though she was still annoyed about their last meeting, she was also pragmatic. This was a great opportunity for her to connect with an influential colleague who probably did have something to teach her. She didn't want to alienate Christopher, so she decided to try his approach. Well, Christopher was ready for another onslaught when Mia walked in, but he was delighted to see Mia's notebook and no lists. She seemed ready to listen. So after some small talk, he began. "Let's set some ground rules," he said. Mia sighed to herself. She was ready to work. Why did he want to drag this on? I'd better buckle up, she thought. This is going to be a long ride.
So we'll leave you with that story there, but we really want to kind of we wanted to introduce it just to introduce the concept of leaning forward, but also to introduce you to the format of our book, which is where we take you through these 3 mentoring stories to really introduce these concepts of leaning forward, learning, and leveraging. And the skill that we talk most about in our book is the skill of cultural competency. It really is a skill that's necessary to bridge difference, and it's the skill that allows us to make sense of difference. It allows us to shift and expand our perspective so that we're not limiting it, we're not trying to change it or to turn our perspective into something else or to turn the other person into something else. It requires 3 things. It requires taking ownership, it requires creating awareness and shifting perspective. And, we'll take you through each of those steps, but those are the steps really to successfully bridge differences.
Yeah, so when we talk about taking ownership, what we're really saying is that it's your responsibility to bridge differences. It means recognizing that you need to work on your own ability to communicate across difference. It also means that you might benefit from a broader perspective by acknowledging differences when they appear and taking steps really to invite differences in so they can improve your relationship and your outcomes. So the next one that Lisa mentioned was creating awareness. Once you've taken ownership, you can begin to cultivate self-awareness and awareness of others. Let me say that again, self-awareness and awareness of others. It's important to remember that awareness of others cannot exist without awareness of yourself. So often, particularly in the work context, we're tempted to skip over details. The getting to know you part of the relationship and just get to work. And I can't tell you how many people we have met and talked to who are so eager to get into it, they just skip over it and they just want to roll up their sleeves. You have to remember that in mentoring, the getting to know you is only the first step of the work, and it starts with an understanding of your own cultural lens. So speaking of cultural lens, the third piece is you're going to need to shift your perspective. Cultural competency bridges differences by expanding your knowledge and your perspective. Cultural competency requires the willingness to see things differently. The willingness. There's a curiosity there. It doesn't mean compromising your authenticity or adopting somebody else's point of view. It means noticing and being curious about other perspectives, and really being willing to consider and reconsider your own assumptions when you learn information about yourself and about others.
Thanks, that's helpful.
So there are other elements as well, like thinking about our own identities. You can see on the screen, by thinking about our biases that we all have, thinking about privilege. And these really shape who we are. They shape how we show up, how we relate to each other, and significantly, how other people relate to us.
So can you give us some strategies for how we might go about leaning forward into differences or into difference? And one of the things that occurs to me as I'm listening to you, Lois, is that I'm not clear about who really owns responsibility. Is it the mentor or is it the mentee, in terms of taking ownership, creating awareness, and shifting perspective? Or, obviously maybe it's both. But can you?
Great question. And I would say both people. We're talking about a mentoring, a learning partnership. So each person needs to take ownership. Each person needs to create awareness. And hopefully, each person will shift perspective, will open perspective, and will learn. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's funny, when you asked that question, Becky, it made me think of some marital advice that I got before I got married, when somebody said, in a marriage, it's not 50% one spouse and 50% the other spouse. It's 100% one spouse and 100% the other spouse in terms of responsibility. And the same is true in a mentoring relationship, that it's not 50% mentee and 50% mentor. It's 100% mentor and 100% mentee in terms of the ownership, in terms of the responsibility to take ownership, create awareness, and shift perspective.
Yeah, great question. So there are some things. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, can you give us some strategies about how we can lean forward into those differences?
I think you have to get comfortable just with the whole process of reflecting on your own attitudes and the world around you. It means you have to really think about yourself and be honest with yourself. I think one of the hardest things to do is to be honest about yourself with yourself. We give lip service to it, but how are those lips working when we're talking to ourselves? Another thing is to approach differences. We mentioned the word curiosity. With curiosity instead of judgment. So often we judge first, and then we think, well, maybe we ought to be curious. But to come with an honest curiosity, what is it that you want to know? Then just to reflect on your own identity and your own culture, and that will help you be more aware of and understanding about the differences between you and your mentoring partner. So I guess the key here is to take some time to look in the internal mirror with yourself. The conversation may not be comfortable because you may discover that you do have some biases, you do have some things going on that you really need to face. But it's that internal conversation that's going to be key.
I think being able to identify and ask good questions is critical when you want to bring curiosity in instead of judgment. Jay said that in the chat. Um, do you have any questions that are, in your back pocket for situations like this? I was thinking on the example from the narrative about Mia when she wanted to get straight to work. Like, what's a curious question that she could use at that moment to try to be curious instead of judging the fact that it's going slower than she wanted?
It's a great question. We actually recommend that people use something we call power questions, and if you're interested in those, you can go to centerformentoring.com and download those for free.
And they're questions like, what's an ideal day? What sorts of things motivate you? What brings you joy? What does your ideal work day look like? Those kind of things that go a little bit deeper. And, we have mentoring pairs with whom we work who will make time on the agenda at the beginning of each of their mentoring conversations for those questions. And each of them ask and answer it. And they found that it really deepens their ability to lead forward into the differences between them, but also to learn from those differences and really start to exercise that curiosity.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what it means to learn from differences, Lisa.
Yeah.
So once you have done the work of creating awareness and shifting perspective and taking ownership that Lois just talked about, it's what do you do with that, right? We have a maxim where in our society where people say we connected despite our differences. And as somebody who does this work, I cringe sometimes when people say that, because it's not about connecting despite difference, it's about connecting because of difference. Somewhere along the way, we associated difference with something that's bad or divisive, and really difference can be a beautiful thing where we can create connections. So that's what this step is all about, is really how do you learn from those differences? How do you exercise that curiosity that we just talked about? How do you explore the commonalities and the differences? How do you talk about worldviews, about goals for the future? How do you negotiate those differences to communicate more effectively? And the way that you do that is by creating good conversation. So the key point is to engage in conversation, into authentic conversation, and a conversation that moves the learning forward and builds trust. We have for you, Lois started with the Christopher and Mia story, and we're going to take you a little bit forward in the book, back to Christopher and Mia, so you can see a little bit about what we mean. So I just want to read you another short excerpt. Mia stepped into Christopher's office and proffered an enthusiastic handshake. She told him she was eager to learn about his career path. How had he achieved his stature and reputation? What would she need to do to follow in his footsteps as a go-to labor and employment attorney? She explained why and what she wanted to learn from him, and expressed gratitude that he had agreed to mentor her. Christopher could see that Mia was committed to her professional growth. Clearly, she had come prepared for their first mentoring meeting. That was a good sign. But she spoke so quickly, hurrying from one topic to the next, that he was thrown off his game. In response, he moderated the speed of his own speech, hoping it would slow her down. When it didn't, he realized he might have to address this issue, but that would have to come later in their relationship. Maybe she was nervous, or maybe it was just a generational thing. He decided to ignore it for now. When Mia finally took a breath, Christopher jumped in. You have a lot of questions, Mia, but I'd like to get to know you a bit before we get into all that. Tell me about why you became an attorney, and why did you choose labor and employment? So you see here that instead of just diving right in, what they're doing is really learning from those differences and really seeking to find out more about what makes each of them tick. The key requirement is building trust. And so, and the key requirements for trust really are this curiosity that we talked about. It's vulnerability, it's authenticity. And authenticity means making meaningful connections, which really can only come when each person's fully showing up as themselves. Too often, we conform our behavior to meet what we think our partner wants us to be. Right? I just want to say that again because I think it's really important. Too often, we, as mentees, will conform our behavior to be the person we think our mentor wants us to be. And the problem with that is that we're so eager to be liked and to be approved that we end up with a mentoring relationship where our mentor is mentoring an imposter, and we wonder why it's not resonating. So it's really important to welcome that curiosity and vulnerability. It really sets a great foundation to learn from those differences.
Well, and it seems like I might have gotten ahead of myself with asking you about questions. So are there some other questions that we can incorporate in order to build that more authentic connection with our mentor or our mentee?
Yeah, I think it's those questions that we talked about. I see actually, I'm not catching all of the comments, but just as you were asking that question, somebody said the mentor has to be authentic as well. And I just want to respond to that, Becky, in addition to your question about what those questions are. I think that's exactly right. It's not just about the mentee showing up authentically. It's about the mentor showing up authentically. And so what happens is, both people have to create a trusting relationship. This goes back to what Lois was talking about in terms of taking ownership. And when that happens, when both the mentor is showing up authentically, very often that's where the vulnerability comes in first. Because of a power imbalance between the mentor and the mentee will be waiting for the mentor to demonstrate what the rapport should be in the relationship. And by being a little bit vulnerable and yes, authentic, right, that will encourage the mentee to be authentic and vulnerable. So thank you to whoever raised that comment. That was really helpful in demonstrating what we're talking about today.
So I would also add a piece to that, and that would be that it's not just about the authenticity in answering the question, but it's also the authenticity in asking the question. And by that I mean, don't ask questions just to ask them. It's helpful, and we've often suggest this when people are meeting their mentoring partner for the first time. What is it you really want to know about this person? What are those burning questions that you have? Not that you're going to spill and ask all of them at once, but come to asking questions from genuine authenticity and a desire to know.
That's where the preparation and reflection comes in. You know, so often we'll take participants in our workshops through an exercise where they spend the time before they ask the tough questions reflecting on their own answers. And it's amazing the insight that comes up. I tend to be somebody who wings it, right, when I have conversations with people. And what I've found through my own exploration into mentoring is that reflection time, which doesn't come naturally to me, really enhances the quality of that conversation. And that's something we encourage our mentors and our mentees to do so that they can ask the questions, they can show up and have the deeper reflection.
Sure. So one thing I'm curious about when people are in a formal mentoring program, and I'm sure that you have tons of expertise with this, you know, what is a typical feeling? Are the mentees excited to participate? Are they nervous about who their mentor is? Are they happy about the pairing? What have you seen in terms of that? And how does this process of preparing and exercising curiosity help with that?
Well, I would say all of the above. You have people whose arms, very often in a formal mentoring program, are being twisted. There's an old saying, you gotta want to learn.
Yeah.
And you have to be there for the right reason. Are they excited? Yes. For some people, this is the first time they are going to feel or know that they're going to feel supported in the organization. Are they excited? Yes, they have a mentor, someone who they've admired for a long time, and they're going to have face time with them and dedicated time, and they're going to learn from them. So in my experience, it's a panoply.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, they come in with their arms crossed
As opposed to their arms open.
Right.
Not just because their
arms twisted, right? But because maybe they were matched with somebody who they didn't think might be an ideal fit. And our job is really to help
mentors and mentees
not just make the most of their relationship, but really make their relationship count. We spend a lot of time helping create that relationship so that they can go in and they can take either those crossed arms or those twisted arms and really make them much more open. And by the way, it's not just the mentees who are nervous and excited and happy and sometimes a little irritated. The mentors sometimes are the same.
Mentors, it's funny, we often assume that mentors, just because by virtue of their position, feel really confident in their ability to mentor. And what we hear over and over again when we talk to mentors is, what was the biggest surprise? The biggest surprise is that I actually have something to offer.
Wow.
Wow. Even for some of the most senior folks. And we're always surprised to hear that, but the truth is, I think what leaders learn is that the skill of leading is not the same as the skill of mentoring. And so there's some trepidation going in, how am I going to do that? And yet, when people are able to lean into that, not to double up on our lean forward metaphor here, but when people are able to, really be honest about those nerves, it makes a big difference. And it's important, another antidote to that is creating communities of mentors and mentees so they can lean on each other and learn from each other that way.
That makes a lot of sense, Lisa. Thank you. So let's talk for a moment about this idea of leveraging differences. What does it mean to leverage our differences?
Well, that's a really big concept for us, because more than anything else, it has to do with maximizing your advantage. So when we leverage difference, you're really taking what you've learned about mentoring and bridging difference, and you're applying it. And and in that way, you're enhancing it to its maximum advantage. So what do we mean by that? What does that look like? Well, as you see on the slide here, certainly this word applying is important. But we've talked about leaning forward. We've talked about learning. Now you take that learning, and what you do is you establish accountability assurances. An example of that would be ground rules or confidentiality agreements. What you really want to do is to come to consensus and forge an agreement about how you're going to be together, how you're going to relate to one another, who is going to be accountable for what. And out of that, you also want to leverage your learning by articulating goals. And that's a whole process. It takes, as Lisa talked about, good conversation to be able to take broad goals, narrow them down so that they're SMART goals and they're achievable within the time frame of the relationship. So also, another way to leverage differences is to be able to create a work plan. So all of that, plus bringing the relationship to closure, are ways that you can leverage difference. So that's really important. Now, one of the things that mentors do is they provide support and they help mentees set a vision for success and challenge them. I think before I speak any more about that, I think we ought to revisit Mia and Christopher for a moment. So here's part 3, and we hope with the story we're enticing you to read more and find out more. When several of the mentees in Mia's cohort asked if she'd had her dinner meeting yet with her mentor, she was puzzled. She hadn't known that was supposed to occur. She wondered why everyone else was having their mid-year check-in outside the office. She was getting fed up with Christopher's lack of communication. Mia decided not to wait to discuss this. It was time to bring up her concerns with Christopher. She wanted to know how he felt she was really doing and whether something had happened to get their mentoring relationship off track. But before Mia could say a word, Christopher made it easy when he asked her how she was doing. She swallowed hard and then proceeded cautiously. Point here is that feedback is also a way to leverage difference. And one of the things that mentors do is that they support their mentees. They also help their mentees articulate and work towards a vision, and they also challenge their mentees. And if you are a mentee listening to this, what would be very helpful for your mentor is to be able to let your mentor know, what would support look like for you? What would be a good challenge for you? How do you work with challenges? How do you accept challenges? What would be too much of a challenge? And then just the whole piece around vision. Any ideas that you have, and what you would need to articulate a vision. So it's really essential to have this conversation about what support, vision, and challenge would look like for you and your mentee. Mentees, we know, most likely feel support when mentors provide structure, when they express positive expectations, when they serve as advocates, and when they make the relationship special. If you're a mentee, let your mentor know how they can best support you. By helping mentees articulate and crystallize a vision, mentors prompt mentees to move forward. Mentees imagine new possibilities for themselves. And then that third component, challenge. It's critical for mentors and mentees to discuss specific things that the mentor can do to help them step outside their comfort zone. So one of the things that we always say is it's important to establish a zone of comfort, but it's also important to step outside that zone of comfort, because when you do that, that's when the real learning takes place.
So that's really helpful. I don't know, I'm thinking about that and relationships that I've had, because I have never been in a formal mentoring program like so many on the call. And it is powerful when someone can help you step out of what's comfortable.
Yeah.
So let's shift and talk for a moment. I think there may be a lot of misconceptions that we bring to the idea of mentoring, and I would love to hear what are some of the common misconceptions about mentoring that the two of you encounter.
Yeah, here's a few of the most common. One is that mentoring doesn't take preparation. You get matched up and you go. And we've already talked about the importance of reflection. We've talked about the importance of taking the time for that self-awareness, but there really is a preparation that's involved, and it's not just a preparation by the mentee. We encourage mentors to take notes and to keep their thoughts, whether in a journal, a file, a legal pad, back of an envelope, whatever it takes, to be able to revisit that before the next mentoring meeting. And also for the mentee to really prepare. So it does take preparation, and even if you're good at winging conversations, you're not going to go as deep if you don't take the time to prepare. Was there something you wanted to say?
I was thinking that a lot of people think that mentoring is just organic, and it just happens, and that's why they don't have to prepare for it. They want to be in the moment. But we know from years and years of research that preparation, not just preparation to be with the mentee, but preparation to be yourself is key.
100%. I think it's also really important, particularly with this crew where we have a half or so who's in a formal mentoring and some who haven't, is this is not to discount the value of informal mentoring relationships. Informal mentoring relationships are important and can be of a lot of value. It's not an or, it's an and, right? There's something about an informal mentoring relationship that can be really beautiful, really helpful, and incredibly meaningful. I know both Lois and I have had those relationships in our own professional careers. In terms of formal mentoring relationship, that's where you start to measure results. That's where you have the intentionality of development. So both can be really, really useful. And I just want to make it clear that though we are real proponents, advocates of, and focus our work on formal mentoring relationships, that it's not discounting the importance and the significance of informal mentoring relationships.
Sure.
The other thing that, just to answer one more misconception, Becky, is this idea that the mentor drives the learning and relationship. Used to be a view that this mentor is like the wise old owl from the Tootsie Roll commercial in the 80s, right? Where like, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop, and just brings a Tootsie Pop and looks for the answer. But it's not, it's really about the mentee driving the learning and the mentor facilitating the learning. And that's a really important distinction, I think.
Yeah, I think so. So as you were talking about the misconceptions, one thing that has been swirling in my mind is how a mentor is different from a coach. Could you clarify that for us?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start, and then you can, Lois, pop in. So mentoring and coaching, I like to think of it almost like a Venn diagram where there's a little bit of overlap. Mentors use coaching skills. All
mentors are coaches, but not all coaches are mentors. And so the skill of coaching is something that is discrete, that is based on solving a particular problem, that is led by the coach using their toolbox. If you hire me as your coach to help you set a vision for your life, and you show up in my office and I say, all right, what you got as your coach? You're going to say, why are you my, why bother hiring you, right? What tools you got, right? In a mentoring conversation, it's quite different. A mentor asks the questions to help draw out the vision without coming with the toolbox that a coach comes from, but with coming with a toolbox of experience and the toolbox of listening and insight.
Okay.
Can you add?
Well, I guess another way of phrasing it is that they're kindred spirits, and I see coaching as really focused more on the present and boosting performance. And as we look at mentoring, we're really focusing on development in the future. Make sense?
Interesting. So a coach shows up in the moment to address whatever is present for me, while a mentor helps me have a vision for the future and take steps to get there.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's why I say mentors sometimes need to use those coaching skills. Sometimes there's something that's so present for the mentee that if you don't address what's on their mind in the moment, you can't get to the development work. The problem happens if you spend too much time in the moment and never get to those development goals.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, so, I'm curious to hear from you about your experience in partnering with organizations to implement mentoring programs. I'm curious what you've seen and what companies might expect if they embrace the idea of mentorship and they implement formal programs. What type of outcomes or changes might they see in their workforces?
And I think people, as a result of mentoring, they feel heard and they feel valued for who they are. Because in a mentoring relationship, you need to show up for who you are. In one sense, it's almost a practice zone, a safe zone to hone the relationship skills. We have seen people learn things about themselves, about building relationships. Take what they have learned in mentoring, and I'm using the word leverage there, but here leveraging it, and taking it to the next level in other arenas of their work and their personal life. So I would say absolutely, and that also results in more engagement. Do you want to speak to that, Lisa?
I think there's a tangibility to it and an intangibility to it. So some of this is the stuff that Lois was just talking about, which is really significant. This idea of increased engagement, this idea of feeling more empowered. And then there's also things that are quantitatively measurable, right? Increased retention, increased engagement, decreased turnover. We have a particular organization that we work with that we're in our 7th wave of mentoring initiative with them, and they are seeing an increase both in the engagement of their diverse associates, right? But also in the elevation, promotion, and contribution of diversity and the inclusive behaviors of their leadership as a result of this program. So because you get this expanded perspective, because, I used to lead diversity and inclusion for an organization, and I'm really passionate about the importance of diversity and inclusion programs and leadership work, but it doesn't move the needle as quickly as creating relationships across difference in the workplace where people start to know difference.
Instead of it being an idea and a value, both of which are really important, but this brings it to life. And so what you start to see is much more inclusive workplaces where you have people contributing and contributing authentically. This leads to innovation. It's a great, attraction tool. So that is another huge thing that you start to see as a result of more mentoring in organizations.
I think that innovation piece is really important because people feel that it's safe to risk, to put their ideas out there where they may not have had that competence and that confidence without mentoring.
Wow. So those are some huge benefits. And I have a couple of other questions swirling in my mind, but I want to make sure that everyone on the call also knows that we welcome their questions as we come to the end of the time together. So I do want to invite everyone to type questions in the chat. You can select all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your questions. And as we have time, I will get to those. I just wanted to fuel that seed that idea to be typing some questions. So, in talking about the benefits of mentoring programs, I'm curious about, what someone might do if they work in an organization where there isn't a formal mentoring program, and what ideas you might have about how they could seek out a formal relationship for growth and
Yeah.
development.
It's a great question. You don't need a formal mentoring program to have a formal mentoring relationship. I think that's really, really important. So I'm really so glad you asked that question. So what do we mean by that? I mean, one of the things, the tools that we talk about in the book and the tools that Lois talks about in the mentor's guide and the mentee's guide are about setting up the structure, right? So and that in itself can constitute a formal mentoring relationship. Structure, expectations, and accountability. Structure, expectations, and accountability. So discovering as a mentee, what is it that you want to learn? And who can help you learn that? Remember, it's not about the who helps you yet. First, it's about the what. So what is it that you want to learn? Then who can get there? And before you just approach somebody whom you admire to be your mentor, make sure you've taken the time to reflect what it is, whether there's a learning fit, right? Will that person have the time and the willingness, right? And then setting those expectations. And then using the skills that we talk about in the book, about really bridging those differences. But just because somebody is voluntarily being your mentor outside of a mentoring program doesn't mean that you shouldn't set up these expectations. It becomes a great grounding and a foundation for the relationship going forward.
I think that's right, Lisa. It's really about what is it that you want to learn. It's not just, oh, that's a great person, I followed this person, I really admired this person. You need to think about what is it that you need to learn and what kinds of characteristics and attributes might you want in a mentor. And then to take that information and use your network. Make sure your net is working and share, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I'm interested in learning, who do you know, and get some ideas and go talk to several people, and you'll know whether there's a learning fit once you've had some really good conversation.
Sure, that's really helpful. The place that my mind jumped next when you started talking about networking, Lois, was to the idea of sponsorship. And I'm curious whether you ever see, people who work with a mentor, then those mentors becoming their sponsor in the organization.
Often. So just for those who don't know, here's the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. A sponsor is somebody who becomes an advocate for their sponsee when that person is not in the room. So it might be, Becky, I know you have designs to be the top communication professional at this organization, and I happen to be in a room where we were talking about creating this opportunity, and I put your name in for that, right? In some ways, a mentor needs to seek permission from the mentee to do that. A sponsor has that authority by virtue of their sponsorship to do that. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of permission and boundaries there as well. But very often at the conclusion of a mentoring relationship, or at some point in the mentoring relationship, there's a switch between what happens in that sponsoring. The sponsorship skill is a really important skill too, and there's a delicacy to that as well, but it's an important one, and there's a lot of crossover.
So I think one point to remember too is if you're working in an organization where there is a mentoring program and you have a sponsorship, you have sponsors and you have mentors, it's extremely important to articulate the difference in the roles and to make sure that your mentors understand what their role is, your sponsors understand their role, they understand where there's crossover and where there isn't, and your mentees and sponsees understand that difference. Because if the roles get confounded, expectations become ambiguous and there is little satisfaction.
A great point.
Thank you for that. So there's a ton of questions that have come in, and I'm going to try to get to as many as I can. Um, but Melissa was wondering if you could talk about benefits to mentors. So what benefit is there in becoming a mentor?
Yeah, I love that question. And I'll also address one that I see at the same time, which is whether mentors can be paid for their services. I think those go well together. Benefits to mentors. So we hear over and over again from mentors that the mentoring has helped their own leadership and their own ability to lead their team, because it is really building a skill of listening and a skill of connecting that can be really, really valuable. I would also say expanded understanding of things that happen in the organization. We have one mentoring pair. Actually, we've based one of the composite stories on this, Darren and Martin, where Darren is the mentor and has been in the organization for quite a long time, and he learns through his relationship with Martin, who's many levels junior to him in the organization, about processes and practices in the organization that are broken or not ideal, right? So helps with that perspective in terms of actually doing the job. There is a heart, I would say there's a head, a heart, and a past benefit, right? The heart is, it feels good, feels like it's a great thing to do, you're giving back. Not to minimize that, that's actually really important and a great driver. There's a head piece, which is really that improvement of skill. And then there is a past piece, which is this illumination of how to do your job better, how to lead better, how to learn more about the organization. So I think that those are three. Anything else you can think of?
Well, one of the things that we find is when we train people and they learn about mentoring, is they learn to mentor better. We've had many people say to us, I've been mentoring for years, and now that I understand the structure and the expectation, I want to go back and apologize to the people that I've been mentoring. They missed out. My bad.
So the second piece of the question is whether mentors can be paid for their services. Yes. You want to be really careful. There are organizations that do that. You see that often in an academic setting, sometimes in some not-for-profit or association. You just want to be really careful about setting accountabilities, because this is not about a boondoggle, right? This is about giving back, and some of it, as I said, is quantifiable, some of it is quantitative, some of it is qualitative, but really having measurements and accountabilities when you do that and setting forth what the expectations are. And also confidentiality becomes extra important when you're talking about being paid for your services. Why? Because you have this dual conflict of who's paying me, right? And where is that piece? So you have to be very, very careful in setting up a paid mentorship. It does happen within organizations. You see it also a lot with entrepreneurs or individual people who have small companies have paid mentorships. And sometimes I say that that's more coaching or kind of advising than mentorship, but not always.
So one piece to add on to that, it has to be culturally relevant. If yours is a culture where people are not paid for things and you bring that in, there's going to be a rub there as well. So it has to fit in with how things are done in your organization.
Aligned, culturally aligned, yeah.
Got it. So we have a pretty complex question, but I think I'd like to get to it if we can. So this listener is saying she's part of a diversity and inclusion committee in an organization, and one of the projects is a mentoring program. Occasionally they have problems selling the program to staff, so they have roadshow presentations, graduations, intakes, and certificates. Can you provide any ideas for them that could help attract more participants? Currently they use online applications and online matching. So the idea is, how do you attract people to a mentoring program, a formal one?
Yeah. You know, it's going to be an unsatisfying answer of it depends, but let me clarify just a little bit. Again, it has to be aligned with what the organization is doing. So the best way to sell a mentoring program is to make it so that it's not something that is freestanding, alone, and other. It has to be aligned. What are the strategic imperatives of your organization? What are the cultural values? What is the mission and the vision? And how is the mentoring program aligned with that? So that is the first thing to think through. Do not have separate, you can have a separate mission of the mentoring program, but it has to map up to the mission of the organization itself. And it has to use the same language. That's thing one. Thing two, what is your leadership saying about mentoring, and are they mentoring? Are they walking the talk and walking the walk? Are they talking the talk and walking the talk, or whatever the saying goes, right? What are they saying and doing that's congruent with that initiative? Because I will tell you right now, staff is not going to buy in if their leaders are not demonstrating that it's important. The other piece of that is, are the leaders making time and protecting the time of their mentors and their mentees to meet with one another? Or is the regular staff meeting always an urgency that's scheduled over people's mentoring time? So that's thing one. That's thing two. The other thing is, build into your mentoring initiative the expectation that mentees find a way to communicate what their progress is in the mentoring relationship with their supervisors and their managers, so that supervisors and managers can start to see what the improvement is and encourage that, and then they become the evangelists for your mentoring program, and they help you do what you do.
So just to tag on to that, I think what's really critical is to make a compelling case. And that means selling it to the stakeholders, to your mentors, to your mentee, as Lisa was talking about, to your staff, we talked about leaders, we talk about to your sponsors. But what are those compelling things that would make a difference? And once you develop those lists, actually go out to those stakeholders and say, are these, do a trial run. Are these compelling to you?
Yeah, 100%. As to online application and online matching, online application I think is a great idea. Online matching has mixed results. People are not algorithms, and mentoring is a relationship above all else, and it's very hard to use numbers to predict relationships. What we found is a mix of online tools and the personal touch is very, very effective. So we recommend often that organizations form what we call a mentoring advisory team, and that they play a hand in some of the matching. You can certainly use an online algorithm to help. The power of story is an incredibly powerful tool in matching. And there's some great tools out there. One is called Tribute Mentorship, where you are having the matching of mentors and mentees that are self-selecting based on story, and you can still set some parameters so that there's enough of a difference in level, and you want to match to encourage diversity in mentoring relationships. So, online can be great, but don't forget the human touch as well.
Sure. That's really, really helpful, Lisa. I know you kind of qualified your answer that you were going to say it depends and it wasn't going to be helpful, but I thought that answer was exceedingly helpful. So I hope that the person who asked the question feels the same way. So we have come to the end of our time together, but we want to make sure that we circle back to ways that you can stay more connected to Lisa and Lois and the Center for Mentoring Excellence. The first thing is to find the book on Amazon and all the other important online retailers, Bridging Differences for Better Mentoring, and buy a copy today, or find out about bulk purchase options for your organization if this book can add value to your organization. If you've already read the book, we would love to remind you to post an Amazon review. We already have 18. It's amazing. We'd love to have more. Even a few sentences can help. You can stay connected to Lisa by going to centerformentoring.com, and you can download the Power Questions resource that Lisa mentioned, and also find Lisa and Lois and the Center for Mentoring on social channels as well. Any kind of parting thoughts or inspiration as we end the time together today, Lisa or Lois?
Well, I would say, I hope that you've walked away with the idea that there is so much more to gain out of mentoring when you're prepared, when you're authentic with yourself, when you're authentic with other people, when you're genuinely curious, and you really want to learn and expand your perspectives.
They ditto that, or true that, as my kids would say, and also, really understanding that the differences between us are things that are beautiful and to be leaned into and to be explored. And that's no time more needed than now, and nowhere more valuable to start with than on an individual basis in relationships in the workplace.
Thanks so much to you both, and we look forward to the chance to learn with you in the future.
Thank you.